Before, I thought that this was Russia's last war. Now I'm certain of it, or at least the last war they can fight with conventional forces.
I repeat, we're talking of a partial mobilization only. Only people in the military reserve will be drafted. The priority will be on people who served in the armed forces, who have military specialization and experience. Those drafted before being sent to the places of service will have mandatory additional training, relying on experience gained during the special military operation. The decree on partial mobilization has been signed.
It was a speech in which Putin was actually quite desperate, and even so, I think we should take him very seriously. I believe that it is safe to say that we're now in this war for the long haul, and because it has been so unpredictable since its beginning, I think we should really think the unpredictable.
The news that happened in the wee hours of the morning, which unfortunately woke me up at 2 a.m, was that the Russians have announced what they call a partial mobilization of about 300,000 troops. So I just wanted to get this out there real quick so you guys understood the context and the why. So the Russian space is incredibly low value. The agriculture that exists there is very poor by global standards. So they've never been able to generate the amount of capital that's necessary to have a real road network. If you want to get anything moved from A to B, it's going to almost exclusively go by train, which is part of the reasons why logistics in the Russian army have become so poor, and why the Ukrainians were able to take a couple of rail depots in eastern Ukraine, in Kharkiv, a couple weeks ago, and the front just collapsed. In fact, there's signs that we might be seeing a repeat of that elsewhere in the Donbass, as the Russians are now discovering that they're actually outnumbered locally, and that with all the captured equipment, the Ukrainians actually now have more artillery and more ammo. So if you take a poorly trained, conscripted force in Russia that is badly equipped and put it up against a very motivated and enlarging force that is getting better training from abroad and better equipment from abroad, in addition to the captured stuff, all of a sudden, at least for now, the balance of forces has really changed. And the only way that the Russians have ever been able to fight that sort of war is with more numbers. So they've had about 150,000 troops in area, plus the Chechens, plus their mercenaries. So let's just call it an even 200 for rounding. They're now going to add another 300. This doesn't mean that the nature of the war has fundamentally changed. It means two things. Number one, this is the sort of the Russian war the Russians know how to fight. Just throw bodies after it. The Russians have always had a larger population than any of the countries they've gone to war with, and so they've always tried to win by numbers, and when they have won, that's usually how it has happened.
He did once again outline the further annexation of areas such as Luhansk and Donetsk, but not only that, he will organize referenda in these regions, which are obviously only makeshift referenda in many ways to declare the independence of these areas. And thirdly, and probably more significantly, once again, he threatened the use of nuclear weapons.
I want to remind those who allow themselves such statements about Russia that our country also has a variety of weapons of destruction. And if the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, we will, without question, use all the means at our disposal to protect Russia and our people. This is not a bluff.
This isn't a fundamental break. Yes, the Russians need these troops and they need them badly. But when you've only had 150,000 in theater and you've been fighting for 6 months more or less nonstop, and your logistics have been a mess, 300,000 troops doesn't turn the tide. It just means that you're going to be able to cycle in troops to replace the ones that have become exhausted. So this doesn't give the Russians fundamentally more troops in theater. It allows them to rotate troops through the theater and continue fighting the war in more or less the way that they have been now, which is to say poorly. Obviously, it's still bad news for the Ukrainians. But ultimately, this is getting to one of the core issues that I've been talking about since the beginning. The Russian demographic is horrible, and between guts or massive increases in the death rate or massive decreases in the birth rate, or both, because of World War I, famines, World War II, the Brezhnev mismanagement, the post-Cold War collapse, there's these deep gouges out of the population structure across the Russian system, with the deepest one in people aged roughly 15 to 30, because you've got a stacking up through the generations of bad things that happened in World War I and World War II and post-Cold War. That's where all these troops are coming from. So we've already got about 200,000 men in theater who are in their 20s. We're now adding another 300,000, and we're starting to get to the point where the Russians just aren't going to have any more men in that generation to throw at this at all. And I don't know if you guys were aware, but people in their 20s are the ones who usually have kids. So we're taking what is already the most demographically fragile demographic and putting them into an open-ended war, which makes it very difficult for them to father or raise children. This is potentially a country killer. Before, I thought that this was Russia's last war. Now I'm certain of it, or at least the last war they can fight with conventional forces.
I actually conclude that I'm not sure any of these 3 points, mobilization, annexation, referenda, and nuclear, will actually work, but it does show you the level of his desperation.
Will the Ukrainians be able to repeat the feats they've been doing? It's entirely possible, but keep in mind the scale of what needs to be done here. With the size of the territory in question, the Ukrainians need to pull off what they've done in the first 2 weeks of September another 20 times. I'm not saying that's impossible. I'm just saying that that is the scale of what is going on here. So expect the Ukrainians to do 2 things. Number one, continue to hammer as many logistical points that the Russians rely on as possible. Anything they can do to disrupt the flow of men, material, and especially food supplies to the front line is something that is going to crush the Russian demographic that is responsible for the soldiers and responsible for propagating the Russian condition in the first place. Second, look for them to reach specifically for transport nodes, not just ones that are near the front line, but ones that might seem a bit of a Hail Mary, not to strike, but to capture. The one I am most interested in, of course, is Mariupol, because if the Ukrainians can reach Mariupol, they basically isolate Russian forces throughout southern Ukraine. And then you're talking about 100,000 Russian troops that are just stranded with no hope of resupply at all. If the Ukrainians are going to win this war, they have to take massive bites out of not just the Russian army, but the Russian demographic. And doing that, destroying the Kerch State Bridge, isolating Crimea from the rest of Russia, that is how that is done. And now that the Russians have obliged to throw another 300,000 troops into the grinder, we may be seeing the beginning of the Russians' end here. It is still the Russians' war to lose. But they're following the playbook, and that makes them a little bit easier to predict.
I think he's actually in trouble, both politically and militarily. And politically, I mean both outside of Russia and inside of Russia. I'll get to that in a second. And militarily, he has now suddenly been pushed back by the Ukrainian forces who are regaining territory that the Russian military had previously acquired. So I think the thinking here is that without the actual mobilization, Russia might potentially lose this war in Ukraine, and that raises the risk, obviously, for Putin. However you define loss, of course, the definition of the war itself, which he actually calls still a special operation, and the definition of a victory keeps on getting narrower and narrower. But I think he feels genuinely threatened that things are not looking well. And I'm not trying to analyze his mannerism with his closest military advisors, but it's just a reality on the ground. So therefore, I think the timing is there now that he wants to send a message to the West and the rest of the world and to Ukraine that he's actually ready to escalate this, that this is not going to stop here. Even if he might be bluffing, say on nuclear weapons, and he said he's not bluffing, but even if he might be bluffing, take him seriously. This is not the moment for complacency and thinking that he's not going to do what he says. Quite often he does.